At one point during the 60s, the Soviets begin to expand out. You see, obviously, everything that happens in China, but also they start to take parts of Africa, they start to take parts of India, and they take Cuba. We're talking like only a couple of miles away from Florida. They throw a communist revolution and succeed. And Cuba flips. And this is a panic moment, because all of a sudden now, the Western Empire is imploding. Weaponized resentment is showing itself as a more powerful psychological force than anything else. And it's winning. And the Americans are like, what happens if we get contracted into this tiny piece of like, the USA? What happens is like all Stalin needs to do, or all the Soviets need to do, is rush into Europe. They keep throwing color revolutions in Africa, in wherever, and this will happen. So we'll be trapped. We'll be this tiny little island surrounded from China and Russia. And oh my God, we can't let this happen. So what do the Americans do? What do the Americans do? John F. Kennedy comes in, an Irishman, and he becomes a libtard. He becomes a libtard cuck. And he says that in order to fight against this, his major concern was the communist problem. We're going to have to liberalize the Western Empire. We're going to have to make it more open. And this is just a kind of a real politics thing. And so what does Kennedy do? Kennedy does several fascinating things that lead to very bad revolutions. He writes this book, The Nation of Immigrants. It's promoted by the ADL, so the Jews love this. And then he writes this, and he's talking and working through a reform to immigration policy to open it up to the world. Why? Because he wants to offer this friendly American dream to the whole world. Why? Because that sounds good. The Soviets coming in saying Marxism, weaponizing resentment, that actually works because capitalism does look like a colonial project of exploitation. So JFK comes in and he wants to revolutionize this. He wants to say, no, let's do the American dream. So everybody will want to buy into our lovely little state. So he does this. And he says, all right, let's go American dream mode, chuds. He pushes for this immigration reform. Now he gets shot before that gets put through, but he's pushing for it. And he does various things like set up international aid systems. So this is all about subtlety. He goes to all these governments and he says, listen, we're going to offer you the USA, the NGO system that is now the substructure that's, destroying all of these countries around the world because America became so left-wing. But he sets up this infrastructure. So he goes into, Africa and things and he says, yeah, we'll give you US aid. We'll set up NGOs. We'll funnel money into you. And we'll be the generous heads of the world. We'll funnel money into all you guys. And use it. We'll literally bankroll you like charity to make you rich and wealthy. So this is not capitalist exploitation. This is us literally sending you US aid. And this obviously is it's just like, this is based. Awesome. Free money. So all these NGOs get set up. And this gives them influence power. Kennedy sets up the special forces, the badass Navy SEALs, the Green Berets. Kennedy sets this up because he doesn't want to do things like Vietnam. He doesn't want to go in and invade with these wars because this looks bad. It's very good propaganda. Look, the imperialist capitalists are invading again. It's really bad propaganda. So he sets up targeted warriors, super warriors, which is really manly and great for the Americans because they're like, wow, I'd love to be a super warrior. And it also then allows them to do precision strikes that isn't as like crazy as this big invasion. So Kennedy does a lot of stuff like this, and go look into this. It's quite interesting. There is this huge liberalization in response to this beast of communism. And it makes sense. Maybe they just didn't see where this would go down the line. They didn't anticipate that it would lead to a total replacement of the American population. But this is the logic. There is logic here. Now, at the same time, there is this force entering into the consciousness of the Americans. So they're liberalizing in the government, number one. They're going more left, if you will, in the government. But obviously, the communists are working a lot of psychological operations in America themselves. You have people like McCarthy saying, there's communists everywhere, this type of thing. And there's this also natural thing taking place. So there's three forces here. This natural thing taking place where the American state and nation is so successful that they are also saying to themselves, listen, let's become a bit more woke. Let's turn off our posterior medial frontal cortex. We are the victors of the world. Everything is much more comfortable now. You see these natural institutions change inside of the mind. So you have these psycho-spiritual problems taking place, just like Dostoevsky pointed out that the demons were being born inside of the Russian soul and the various demographics within that as well. You see the same thing happen in America. So what goes on in the 60s is a collection of fascinating things. The beginning of a non-manly revolutionary, Russian communist overthrow state, a militant version of communism. Instead, something new is born, which is this civil rights wokeism. The civil rights wokeism starts to seed. And it blossoms out of all of this context. Martin Luther King, things like this, free the blacks, end segregation, US aid for the world. John F. Kennedy goes to Portugal. A lot of right-wing chuds don't like this, and he goes to Portugal and he says, stop your colonial empire. Because Portugal were losing Goa, they were losing Angola because of these communist revolutions. And instead of the Americans helping them keep this together, Kennedy gave them an ankle bites them and says, no, guys, let that go. And this is disastrous. Portugal falls apart. They lose their colonial empire and it turns into a rump state and becomes basically like poverty-induced for ages then afterwards. Like Portugal's empire was nearly the size of Europe. And then by the 70s, they were going through nearly communist revolutions themselves. So this is this total breakdown of the European imperial world empire. This in this beginning of the idea that we have to have a good relationship with the colored people of the world in order to compete with communism. And then obviously all these other forces taking place. So this sets up this context then for wokeism. There's a baby crying outside because of how hard I'm going. So what takes place in this 60s context is a critical pivot and transformation of this left-wing movement, of the spirit of the left. Because what basically happens is this reformation by Kennedy is actually quite successful. America becomes this propagandistic empire that produces 1960s rock and roll. It is a party for everyone in the world. It's about being wealthy, about being creative and musical. And this militant, aggressive, resentful Soviet, this manly undermensch fight where you throw this proletariat revolution, it all of a sudden starts to look a little bit frigid, a little bit hateful, and they get out-framed. And so the Soviets begin to lose political credibility, and especially during the 80s, it's just like America is cruising. You've got all the glam rock happening, and everybody's like, this is so cool. There's black people in films and stuff. Everybody's like, this seems like a party where everybody's invited. This is awesome. And you can go and you can immigrate to America, and you can do all of this stuff, and US aid is flooding in, and it's this party over the whole world. Everybody loves it. Soviet Union fails. This militant, revolutionary Yuri Bezmenov style, callous, cold, ruthless Soviet project that weaponizes resentment fails. Implosion takes place in 1991. But what happened in the 60s is that many of these principles, which were done perhaps for a function with a lot of other things lumped on top of it, obviously they get transformed into absolute reality. Everybody thinks this is exactly how we should run the world. No one pauses and said, well, we did this for a reason. Is this the right plan that we're following now? And during the 60s, you see this morphing into a middle-class leftism. You get like Herbert Marcuse. He's from the Frankfurt School, an outsider as well, But he is theorizing about how to do, what is the purpose of a left-wing revolution? What is the purpose of these things? And of course, the idea is that you have these Gnostic problems. You feel tyrannized by reality, the state and its norms, such as you have to be Christian and go and get your job in the factory and form a gender role as a wife or a husband. These one-dimensional norms, this is what Marcuse brings up, these one-dimensional norms, these suck. This life path that we're offered, this heteronormative, phallogocentric life path, it's frigid. And we're entering into the 60s. We're entering into the wealth abundance. We're entering into a realm of openness, of psychedelics, the low PMFC period, where we don't have to worry about threats anymore. And we actually are free to explore an individualized conscience. So what happens here? Marcuse says this one-dimensional man is bad. The revolution that needs to take place is the ability to be an individual. In whatever way you so wish. Switch off that posterior medial frontal cortex. Don't engage with evolutionary substructures like gender roles. Don't engage with these life paths that are set out. All this Christianity and nationalism, fuck this. Get rid of this. And this is appealing to people. This is what you see then expressed through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This way of thinking is very dominant. Be yourself. Express yourself. Become who you are. Become an individual. Even Nietzsche and Jung gets bent into shape to suit this, where Nietzsche's quotes, Nietzsche's whole philosophy is about become who you are. It's not about, the esoteric psychology of the future right wing. Strength is the answer to suffering. It's not that. It's individualism. Become yourself. An Ubermensch is self-expression. An Ubermensch is someone with a low PMFC. This is what it is. So Marcuse sets this stage, and you will recognize this because this is the dominant cultural substructure of our current reality. And you get a lot of conservative midwits who literally take on these principles and claim they're rebelling against them. This is so common. I see it all the time. And I find it very funny, because they're promoting individualism. Individualism is the psychology of the West is individualism. This is the values of the West. The propositions of the West is our individualism. And it's like, no, that was the Cultural Revolution in the 60s. Individual, free expression, don't be one-dimensional. Basically, don't be conservative and don't be a Christian and don't be these things. Become something else. Explore occultism. Try out Hinduism. Try out Buddhism. Try out yoga. Go to the out. Reject the one center. And this is what you see happen here. So this becomes a middle-class cultural norm. And as people like Gramsci say, another leftist theorist, the revolution does not necessarily happen in the political state. It happens in the cultural systems, the institutions, the cultural hegemony. And so now all of a sudden you see the overthrowing of Christianity, the overthrowing of nationalism, the overthrowing of pretty much any sense of self-pride and worship, and this beginning of bending towards the outgroup. And even the concept of American nationalism gets defined by freedom and individualism. And that's what it becomes. And it's not like this wasn't powerful. There's a lot of things about this that are incredibly compelling. And I think a lot of people who think of themselves as right wing should be careful, because throwing away with the things that you don't like, a lot of them, your ability to even decide to be what you are, your desire for freedom, like a lot of this comes from these type of things. And of course it serves a function, kind of makes sense. This expressiveness of the West, the creative, colorful expressiveness of the West is very powerful against the rigid close-mindedness of the Soviet Union. But come 1990, that all implodes and you see the mood shift. And all these values radicalize. And all of these principles, like the open borders, they continue to radicalize. And a lot of the people, the boomers who grew up in the 60s and internalized these values, they're not Nietzschean critics of their own values. They radicalize their values. They try to do them more. They go harder. And their resentment doesn't get unchecked because they have the moral majority. They have the cultural hegemony on their side. So they can resent, they can bend this into pure hate for the white man. They can turn this into narcissistic pride for their outgroup. They can do this with a good conscience. They can transform individualism into a literal one-dimensional religion. They can do this. And this is what begins to happen. And in this time of great victory where they dominate the world, now it seems like this blossoms and consumes everything. And what happens then in 2010s, in 2015, 2016, is you see this impulse of a backlash take place. People begin to grip. The PMFC begins to turn on. Despite the fact that we live in the richest time ever, in the most comfortable time ever, with the most air conditioning and conveniences, the death of God is achieved. When does atheism reach its peak? The death of God is achieved in 2015. It's achieved in the 2010s. America, we're like 80% Christian, and they drop to 60% by the 2010s. The British majority belief system became atheism. It overthrew Christianity in the 2010s. It's very, very recently. And so this world domination of liberalism, of this left-wing thinking, of the shutting down of the PMFC, of this lifting up of this world perspective, the woke perspective as hegemonic, takes place. And us millennials, we're the harbingers. We're the heralds of the future, the heralds of the woke. This is what takes place. And then out of that comes the monstrous neo-Hitler response, Out of this comes the reaction. Out of this comes the break with this hegemonic way of seeing things. And this huge aggressive nationalism begins to show up. And the PMFC turns on. And you see so many things that trigger this, even like things on social media where there's this migrant hordes coming into Germany and everybody says, these people are actually threatening us. They're dangerous. And that switches on that, who's my group? Who's my tribe? And then this begins to boil up, but everybody pushes away at it because it just seems it's so weak, this reaction. This impulse is so fickle and small because it's kind of like populist chud mob instincts against this lofty hegemonic set of principles such as freedom itself and individualism. And then you have people who are like making racist jokes on the internet. But this blossoms, and then comes 2020 and the lockdowns, and this woke project reveals the irony and hollowness of its values. It reveals itself as perfectly capable of tyranny. And this leads to this massive muscular flip. Belief in God begins to shoot upwards in the 2020s. And people pivot very heavy. And now you see in the youth that they're actually breaking the trend and becoming more religious than before. And this urge begins to shuttle and explode. And then a 1960s cultural revolution happens in the online grassroots sphere. It's like the 1960s psychedelic revolution. Only instead of taking LSD, we're staring at our phones. And all the memes are making people hard right. Furthermore, the revelation of some of these deep Gnostic tendencies begin to expose themselves. Because in some sense, maybe an adaptive liberalism in response to communism, you can see how that can be okay. And a bit of individual expression never hurt anybody. But you see the muscular arrival and thrust of hard woke Gnosticism. This really aggressive hate for oneself, this really aggressive hate for the white man, hate for God. This begins to show up. And this really puts people off. You begin to see what this is in its core. It is a world negating perspective that is very psychologically damaging. You see the arrival of the phenomenon of the transsexual in its pure sense. People begin taking elaborate surgeries. There's people getting prescribed hormones. There's this attempt to shear apart the family. Kids end up getting these therapies done to themselves. And this is all very forceful and very extreme, very hardcore. So the woke lose their credit. A sort of populist psychology forms, and people begin to categorize these people as insane, as crazy, as Redditors. And this creates the culture war. But the problem is that the Trump movement, the reactionary force, succeeds. It gains ground and it becomes more profound, more enriched. Intellectuals show up. It gains more political power. It gets popular consensus. And what Trump does is something quite similar to Kennedy. Trump begins to enforce a restructuring of the American project. Look at all the tariffs. Look at the way he's gutting and allowing Elon Musk to show off what happened with the USAID project. He's showing people that this structure built in the 60s, it has gone awry. It's starting to become a problem. He begins to bring in crypto in an attempt to create this sort of financial buffer for the US Treasury bonds. He's doing all these very interesting and radical things to reforge the American empire, probably with the help and support of a counter-elite within the American project. So he's undoing the woke empire that was built since the 60s. And as a consequence, he has the legitimacy to do this. He wouldn't be able to do it otherwise unless he had a huge amount of legitimacy and cultural legitimacy. And this is very demoralizing for people who made big investments in woke. A lot of people bought into these identities to the point where they've done radical things like castrate themselves and things like this. And it's very brutal because these people who are telling them to do this were in some sense ideologues, exploiting perhaps, or maybe misdirecting them. Instead of offering them something that might have been spiritual to look at these problems they had inside of their mind, they put them on, hardcore hormones and things like this. And so this is having this radicalizing effect. Trump is successfully changing the empire. So all these people enormously invested in the empire, who have changed their lives forever as a participant in this culture, they're feeling existential dread. They're feeling very, very angry. And we have these avatars like Charlie Kirk presenting the heteronormative Christian man with a wife, business guy promoting conservative values and arguing with you and stuff like this. And he becomes a target. He is the rise of this popular perspective. And this huge hate is directed at them. And of course, the American empire itself has become very decadent. It doesn't offer many of its individual citizens much salvation. It's a very exploitative and elitist empire at this point, with a very exploitative financial system. So a lot of the people at the bottom, a lot of the dregs, and this would include, look, us peasants, we're not the people with like billions of assets living in, all around the world and stuff like this. Most people are in dire straits. You have somebody like Luigi Mangione, who's not politicized. He's not left-wing, he's not really right-wing. He's like a centrist Andrew Huberman fan. But he gets botched up by the medical industrial complex and has his spine rewired, and he gets filled with resentment. And this resentment has no outlet but to target these exploiters, these insurance hustlers. So he goes and he executes one of them. You see the same phenomenon in the people who attacked Fuentes, in the transsexuals running after into the covenants and killing Christian children. There's this anguish inside of them. There's this school shooter brokenness inside a lot of people because of the end game of this liberal project seems to have just arrived at its logical conclusion. And there's a lot of anguish and a lot of despair. There's a lot of demons in society, a lot of twisted perversions inside of people. And this radicalizes now because it's been shut out. You can't express this. You can't feel that you're winning a culture war. It feels like your culture and your identity is getting closed off. This ability to freely express yourself and choose who you are as an individual, this seems to be getting bullied out. And instead, a heteronormative, one-dimensional path is getting offered to people as this path to health. You will be happier and healthier if you just accept your gender role and accept life as it is. And so these people radicalize. They see no option. So what they're going to do is turn to violence. This is what has to happen. So this middle-class, cultural, kind of cutesy, let's be all individuals thing now feels like it's losing its grip on reality. And there's a lot of people full of demons, very broken, with deep psychological anguish. And the left can no longer give them satisfactory explanations for this. And so all it can really do is callously radicalize this. And this leads to an escalation in violence. And of course, the right wing is not without its own very jaded, upset people as well. The immigration project has radicalized a huge amount of people. Their threat detection centers are all turning on, and they're like the zealots in ancient Judea. They've gone hardcore. They're out there thinking to themselves, we've got to do something about this now. So what do we have here? These two boiling up vitriolic forces that are now looking at the idea of force, thinking that none of this stuff can be solved with talk anymore. The people who are talking are getting shot, and this leads to an escalation towards conflict. Now, let me step into the dodgy realm of predictions. There's a lot of directions that this could go, because we have this counter-elite in the Trump movement transitioning the American empire. And if they are able to legitimize what they're doing and successfully do it, they will be able to put down the left and offer people a better future, the American Golden Age. That will probably be something like 1960s Part 2, set things on a different direction, and things might get rosy. And the left will be outframed, delegitimized, and pushed away. And their violence will seem insane and weird and not something people want to get involved with. And this would be a very lucky situation and well-managed situation for the Trump movement. Now, they have a lot of problems because, for example, the Israeli-Gaza thing is twisting a lot of people's minds against them. That's actually costing them an awful lot of legitimacy. And it's something that is radicalizing an awful lot of the left, because they're like, well, this regime is literally exterminating people. They're doing violence. So why should we care? And this could show us where things could go very negative, because the left could maintain its legitimacy because of things like this, saying that these guys are evil fascist dictators that are happy to engage in violence. And they would be able to, rally the resentment within people. They would be able to say these ICE raids are an extension of this malice, this horrible force. And they will gain legitimacy. And then their violence looks vigilante. It looks revolutionary, it looks good. Taking on this beast. Somebody has to do it. I'm willing to go to prison for it. This is what some of these people will think. And their hate and their resentment, they can take it out on an enemy that is delegitimized as a monster. So you could have this situation where this terrorism will look like the breakdown of the woke psychology from an irrational perspective, going towards a noble aim at making a new golden age. Or it will look as something very legitimate against a hostile tyrannical regime. And people will develop this callous nihilism around this political violence. And that won't be good, because that means it will escalate. You will see what happens in low-level civil war. This happened in Argentina. This happened in Ireland with the Troubles. This happens with the years of lead in Italy, where basically during the years of lead in Italy, there is a centrist moderate state, and then you have a hard right faction, and then you have a hard left faction, and they're like doing gang warfare basically in this low-level chronic violence that lasts for 30 years. They even kidnap the prime minister at one point and execute him. This stuff gets hardcore, and it does not resolve itself for a long time, because the escalation of violence is tit for tat, and then it blooms into low-level chronic civil war that remains, and trust in society breaks down. And it's important to keep in mind that we're sitting right at that point, because during the 1960s, there were a wave of assassinations. There was Kennedy, there was Martin Luther King. The birth of this woke regime, this, Kennedy's project, it required death. It required this type of chaos. And you could look at what's gone on with the Trump regime so far, an attempt on Trump's life, Charlie Kirk getting executed, Fuentes having attempts on his life. This same birth is taking place. So this is a defining moment here. And maybe like Kennedy's regime, it could stabilize, but maybe not. Maybe it could sink down. And if it sinks down, this is very destructive. It's very, very bad. To give you an example, this is from a guy called Silo Slav on Twitter, who describes the breakdown in tensions in Yugoslavia, in the Balkans. This was only recently in the 1990s itself. I was talking to a friend who grew up in Yugoslavia. He's about 10 years older than me and recently moved back to Serbia. What struck me about his recounting of the years just before the war began was a sense of banality, a kind of timelessness. Despite all the vitriol, it didn't really feel like anything was going to happen right away. But what set off the war, the conflict between the new Croatian state and Yugoslavia, was a single bus attack. A group of Serb paramilitaries opened fire on Croatian police officers near Pakrac, killing several and wounding others. That moment lit the fuse. From there, everything erupted. The war turned brutal very quickly, with civilians swept into atrocities. Imagine being raped in your own bedroom, beheaded in front of your family in the garden, grenades thrown through your window, your bones later collected and dropped into a village well. When I see young people today mocking the death of somebody they disagree with or speaking with ambivalence about assassination, I can't help but think they have no idea how fast things can change. They don't know that violence, once unleashed, doesn't stay contained. And this is something that I know from just speaking to people about the Troubles, which is something I'm definitely not a profound expert in or anything like this. But it was that same thing where actually during the 60s, the Catholics were trying a civil rights march and they decided, right, well, take it easy in the whole IRA thing for a little while. And then there was a wave of executions and some assassinations by the Protestants. And then very quickly, a breakdown in the civil order. The British state comes in and puts a hard foot down and controls the situation. But the two gangs, who were marked as terrorist groups by the establishment, form this vigilante low-level chronic civil war, and it lasts for 30, 40 years. And you just don't get out of it. And it is absolutely eviscerating of culture, of trust. You can't trust anybody. You become paranoid. You think everybody's trying to screw you over. Everybody's on the other team. The posterior medial frontal cortex switches on to the absolute sense. And you get your hard ideology. You get your clear collective tribe and identity. You get what you want. You get your communism or whatever it is. You fall into something. Like in prison, you have to fall into the Aryan Brotherhood or the Nation of Islam. You have to go hardcore and become identitarian because you're in a fight for survival. But it is shearing. It is shearing to the quality of the culture. And in some sense, it's probably permanently destructive. Russia has, barely recovered from the communist fall. And it's this type of thing. Look how long it took China. It took China, the 1950s when they had the revolution? And only in the 2000s are they beginning to build up momentum again. So it seems like this is the precipice that everything sits on. Which direction it will take, I do not know. I'm just a boyo. But I would like to paint this picture for you because it's something I've thought about quite a lot. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like you all out there to stay juicy. And I'll say goodbye.